In this entry, we'll be taking a look at Otto Octavius, the scientist who eventually becomes known as Dr. Octopus from the 2018 Spider-Man video game that had its debut on the PS4. Commonly touted as a tragic villain, Otto's descent into evil is made even more devastating by the fact that he was the hero's hero, someone who served as a guiding role model for Peter Parker's civilian life. An upstanding genius who undergoes a process of breaking bad as his innermost evil desires are laid out bare in all their ugliness. In his time before his villainous turn, Otto comes across as mild-mannered, soft-spoken, and rather easygoing, traits which are expressed in the very few social interactions he has, the primary one being his working relationship with his lab assistant, Peter Parker. From Peter's own admission, he practically worships Otto, idolizing him for his scientific genius and his work in robotic prosthetics, which, as Peter describes, would allow him to have just as much of a positive impact on the world as his efforts as Spider-Man. In his attempt towards building a new cutting-edge prosthetic, Otto displays a remarkable level of optimism despite the numerous setbacks he constantly faces, a virtue which Peter is repeatedly impressed by. But optimism is like willpower, finite and eventually limited if not replenished. And as it turns out, Otto's optimism was the representation of the mental restraint that held back the potential avenues that would incline him to evil, most prominent of which comes in the form of his animosity towards his former friend turned longtime rival, Norman Osborn. From Otto's recount of their past, they were lab partners in college who went on to start Oscorp as a joint business venture. While the Oz in Oscorp may have referred to both of them, one can easily see how Otto's name is somewhat swallowed up by Osborn's. This eventually turned out to be the case, as conflicting ideologies caused a rift between the two of them, with Otto hinting at Norman's unethical approach in genetics as the cause for the fallout. Since going solo, Otto has had to rely on external financing in the form of grants to continue his work. Given the circumstances, I'm sure that there were undoubtedly feelings of resentment and jealousy towards Norman. Otto must have felt that he did the right thing in trying to correct Norman, and from the fact that lawyers were involved, it would seem that there may have been somewhat of a power struggle over the ownership of the company. So from Otto's perspective, the only reward he has for standing up for what's right is an unceremonious kick out the door of the company he co-founded, as well as jeopardizing his life's work. What makes this fallout even more bitter is the fact that Oscorp has progressed to become a giant in its industry, while in his current state, Otto has to be at the mercy of others and beg for scraps in the form of grants. As Norman describes him, Otto has always been the smartest one in the room. However, till date he has had no breakthrough in his endeavors yet. Such a state would likely induce feelings of inferiority and insecurity, and Otto himself says this as much when he admits in an outburst of frustration that he has always wrestled with seeing himself as a failure. Given that Otto's operation is just a two-man show with him and Peter, he doesn't have much, but as fate would have it, even what little he has would be taken away from him, when Norman, now the mayor, pulls the plug on his project and attempts to swallow up his work into Oscorp. If his anger against Norman was previously simmering in resentment, at this point it would be in the state of boiling over in rage. In all this we see a recurring trait of Otto, that while on the outside he appears meek and docile, inwardly he is very much a suppressed man, pushing down emotions of jealousy, hatred, and insecurity before they can rear their ugly head. Of course, there's nothing wrong with feeling these emotions, and not acting on them is a commendable thing. But eventually, one would need to process these emotions to carry on with life, and for Otto, the only form of a coping mechanism he gets comes in the form of his work, which he drowns himself in day and night. And when that work is threatened to be taken away, It's no surprise that Otto becomes a man backed into a corner who is more ready to adopt drastic measures. However, for Otto, resentment and jealousy are just the tip of the iceberg. On an equal note, another contributory factor of a similar magnitude comes in the form of his sickness, a degenerative neurological disease that would eventually leave him as a prisoner in his own body. So the clock is ticking for Otto, and it's no exaggeration to say that everything from his legacy down to his current way of life is at stake. Naturally, as someone facing the threat of a debilitating illness, Otto's goals are expedited, and perhaps this is where his crucial mistake occurs, being his own human test subject for his prototype mechanical arms. For whatever reason, the safety lapses remain undetected by him, and Peter's hypothesis is proven true, that the intracranial implant would affect the part of his brain responsible for his restrictions and inhibitions, effectively altering his personality. As modern science would tell us, the brain of a psychopath is quite different from that of a regular individual, with deviations beyond the norm in the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the paralimbic structures. But while psychopaths are born with their anomalous brain, and sociopaths develop them due to childhood trauma, for Otto's case, it's suggestible that his brain was transformed into that of a psychopath's well into adulthood due to the effects of the cranial implant. In hindsight, perhaps all this could have been avoided at the juncture where Norman offered Otto the chance to resume his work at Oscorp. It would take a massive eating of humble pie and swallowing his pride, but the overall upside would be worth it. At Oscorp, Otto would have access to nearly unlimited funds and a steady stream of volunteers, allowing him to conduct his testing in a more supervised and documented manner. Of course, this is way easier said than done, and given his seething resentment against Norman, it's understandable that he would all but spit in his face. What makes the situation even more tragic is that Peter could have detected the effects of the cranial implant if he was more involved in the project, something which he partially blames himself for. It's not known as to how long Otto was exposed to the effects of cranial implant, but we do know it was gradual, with his degeneracy slowly developing over time as Otto's suppression of his evil desires is slowly released. The first sign of trouble would perhaps be Otto's idea of advancing beyond typical human capabilities, being no longer content to just restore the function of lost appendages, but to enhance them in speed and strength beyond that of a normal peak human response. It's impressive, but it's also most likely illegal and would never be approved for wide-scale public use. And judging from his secret lair in which we hear of his recorded interactions with the Sinister Six, combined with his detailed plan mapping out the city, we see that this was a moral descent that was long in the making. In his degeneracy, Otto is a stark contrast compared to his former self, with traits like empathy, remorse, and guilt thrown out the window, allowing him to immerse himself in the evil he formerly suppressed. This change goes all the way down to his voice, now a sinister and raspy tone laced with bitterness in his vengeance against Norman, seeking to expose him for the crimes he swept under the rug over the years. Norman does deserve to be brought to justice for his misdeeds, but Otto is not content to take it out directly on him, and instead aims to destroy his empire and smear his reputation. Nothing else would cause him the most pain and suffering, and a quick death would be too lenient a punishment. Unfortunately, this would result in massive collateral damage, and it speaks to Otto's psychopathy that he would be acceptable of this, releasing dangerous inmates from the local prison and unleashing the devil's breath in the middle of Times Square, resulting in the infection of more than 500,000 civilians. But despite his psychopathic tendencies, which are marked by a lack of empathy and sympathy, Otto does retain one shred of goodness within him, namely his sense of care for Peter. Despite knowing his secret identity as Spider-Man, he doesn't reveal it to the public and also spares his life after giving him a fair and final warning. So it would seem that the emotional connection formed with Peter before his degeneracy still remains, and Otto himself makes mention of this in one of his recordings addressed to Peter, telling him that the loss of their friendship will hurt him the most. But this sorrow turns out to be short-lived, as eventually Otto becomes willing to kill him as well. In all this, perhaps the most tragic aspect of Otto's downfall is the loss of his potential contribution to humankind. Where once he was pioneering a work that would help millions, now he is on the other side of the law, displaying a complete lack of regard for human life and securing a place among the ranks of Spider-Man's rogue gallery. Unlike his movie counterpart, it would seem that there is no easy fix for Otto here, with the effects on his brain likely to be permanent. He remains pitiable to the end, begging that his arm should not be taken away from him as he awaits his final debilitating fate. A scientific genius who put his talents to the servitude of mankind, only to undergo pressure from circumstances beyond his control, resulting in a degenerate spiral into the clutches of villainy.